The True History of the American Revolution. Chapter 1. Early Conditions and Causes. The great underlying conditions which brought about the Revolution were the presence of the French in Canada, and the extremely liberal governments, semi-independence, and disregard of laws and regulations which England, in the early days, was compelled to allow the colonies in America. The increasing power of France in the north compelled England to be liberal and even lax in governing her colonies. As the attitude of France became more and more threatening down to the year 1763, England could take no severe or repressive measures with the Americans, who were growing up very much as they pleased. In our time, colonies usually are regarded as places for the overflow of the mother country's excess of population. But down to the time of our revolution, England had no overflow of population. When England began to have colonies in America about the year 1610, her population was only 5 million. At the time of our revolution, it was barely 8 million. And large districts of country, especially in the northern part of England, were still almost as primitive and uncultivated as the American wilderness. Colonies were, in early times, regarded as places for obtaining gold, silver, and furs, and it was hoped that if people could be forced to go out to them, they might be able to extend trade, furnish England raw material, and create a market for manufactured goods. The people who settled in America were either mere adventurous characters like the first Virginia colonists, or Puritans, Quakers, and Roman Catholics driven out of England by the severities of royalists and churchmen. Or they were royalists, like those of the second migration to Virginia, driven out of England when the Puritans under Cromwell got into power. When persecution ceased, there was no migration of any importance to the colonies. Migration to New England ceased after 1640, and in all the colonies the migration was comparatively small. The people increased in the natural way by births, and increased with remarkable rapidity. The 2 million white colonists of 1776 were largely a native stock, whose ancestors had been on the soil for many generations, and they had grown out of an original stock of immigrants which had not numbered 100,000. This native and natural growth is worth remembering when we are seeking to explain the desire for independence. Alluring promises of gold and easy systems of government were the great persuasives to English colonization. The British government, only too glad to be rid of rebellious Puritans, Quakers, and Roman Catholics, willingly gave them liberal charters. This explains that freedom in many of the old charters which has surprised so many students of our colonial history. Some of these liberal instruments were granted by the Stuart kings, with the approval of their officials and courtiers, all of whom showed by almost every other act of their lives that they were the determined enemies of free parliaments and free representation of the people. Connecticut, for example, obtained in 1662 from Charles II a charter which made the colony almost independent. And today there is no colony of the British Empire that has so much freedom as Connecticut and Rhode Island always had, or as Massachusetts had down to 1685. Connecticut and Rhode Island elected their own legislatures and governors, and did not even have to send their laws to England for approval. No modern British colony elects its own governor, and, if it has a legislature elected by its people, the acts of that legislature can be vetoed by the home government. A community electing its own governor and enacting whatever laws it pleases is not a colony in the modern English meaning of the word. Connecticut and Rhode Island could not make treaties with foreign nations, but in other respects they were, as we would now say, semi-independent commonwealths under the protectorate or suzerainty of England. The obtaining of this extremely liberal Connecticut charter has sometimes been explained by suggesting that Winthrop, who went to England to procure it, had money to distribute among courtiers. A pretty story is also told of his having a ring, which had been given to his father by Charles I, and this ring, when shown to Charles II, is supposed to have worked the miracle of the Liberal Charter. But the liberality is more easily accounted for by the desire of the British government to encourage planting, as it was called, and get rid of rebellious and troublesome people. England had not then made up her mind exactly what she meant by a colony, except that she was anxious to have people go out and settle on the wild land in America which was hers by right of discovery. The year after the Connecticut Charter was granted, Rhode Island obtained a liberal charter, almost word for word the same as the Charter of Connecticut. And the agent in that case was the Reverend John Clark, a Baptist minister of the gospel, who had no money and no ancestral ring. Some 30 years before that time, Massachusetts obtained a liberal charter. It was possibly intended that the governing body under this charter should remain in England, but the Puritans who had obtained it moved the whole governing body out to Massachusetts, elected their own legislature and governor, and did not submit their laws to England for approval. They assumed several of the attributes of sovereignty. They coined their own money and issued the famous Pine Tree Shilling. They established by law a form of religion sometimes called Congregationalism, which was not recognized by the laws of England. They ceased to issue writs in the king's name. They dropped the English oath of allegiance and adopted a new oath, in which public officers and the people swore allegiance not to England, but to Massachusetts. They debated what allegiance they owed to England, and concluded that they were independent in government, that no appeals could be taken to England, but that they were under an English protectorate. When captains of vessels reminded them that no English flag was displayed in the colony, they debated whether the British flag should be allowed to fly on the fort at Castle Island, and concluded that it might be put there, as that particular fort was the king's property. But they had given so little attention to allegiance and the symbol of it that at the close of this debate no English flags could be found in Boston, and they had to borrow one from the captain of a ship. Under the charter which allowed so much freedom, Massachusetts existed from 1629 to 1685, when her disregard of British authority and the killing, whipping, and imprisoning of Quakers and Baptists had reached such a pass that the charter was annulled, and Massachusetts became a colony, with a governor appointed by the king, and controlled in a way which, after her previous freedom, was very galling. These instances show why New England was so hot for independence from 1764 to 1776. Virginia was also ardent, and there, too, we find that an extremely liberal government had been allowed to grow up. Virginia had, alone and single-handed in 1676, rebelled against the whole authority of the British government, because she thought her privileges were being impaired. Such an outbreak as this, and a similar rebellion in Massachusetts in 1690, warned England to be as gentle as possible with the colonies, while France was becoming more and more of a power on the north and west. The other colonies never had so much freedom. None of them elected their own governors. They had not had such a taste of independence as New England and Virginia, which, from the English point of view, were regarded as the leaders in rebellion. But they had all had a certain measure of their own way of doing things, and had struggled to have more of their own way, and had found that England was compelled at times to yield to them. It is not necessary to describe the details of this struggle, its successes and failures. It is of more importance to describe a method of government which grew up in all the colonies that did not elect their own governors, a method which they regarded as the bulwark of their liberties, which in England was regarded as scandalous and which had an important influence on the revolution. It arose out of the system by which the people of the colony elected the legislature and the crown, or a proprietor under the crown, as in Pennsylvania and Maryland, appointed the governor. Under this system, the legislature voted the governor his salary out of taxes, which all the colonial legislatures had the power of levying. The governor had the power of absolute veto on all acts of the legislature, and, as representing the crown, he wanted certain laws passed to carry out the ideas or reforms of the home government. The members of the legislature cared little or nothing for these reforms. As representing the people, they had their popular measures, which they wished carried out. These measures the governor usually wanted to veto, either because he deemed them hostile to the interests of the crown, or because he wished to punish the legislature for failing to pass crown measures on which his reputation at home depended. The governor and the legislature being thus dependent on each other, the question of salary threw the balance of power into the hands of the legislature. They quickly learned the trick of withholding the governor's salary until he had assented to their measures. The system became practically one of bargain and sale, as Franklin called it. The people, through their legislators, bought from the governor for cash such laws as they needed. The petty squabbles with the governor, based on the detailed working out of the system, were interminable in every colony where it prevailed. They fill the minute books and records, making colonial history more tiresome than it might otherwise be, except in one instance where Franklin, who often came in contact with the system, described it in his inimitable manner. Hence arose the custom of presents twice a year to the governors, at the close of each session in which laws were passed, given at the time of passing. They usually amounted to £1,000 per annum, but when the governors and assemblies disagreed so that laws were not passed, the presents were withheld. When a disposition to agree ensued, there sometimes still remained some diffidence. The governors would not pass the laws that were wanted without being sure of the money, even all that they called their arrears. Nor the assemblies give the money without being sure of the laws. Thence the necessity of some private conference, in which assurances of good faith might be received and given, that the transaction should go on hand in hand. What name the impartial reader will give to this kind of commerce I cannot say. Time established the custom and made it seem honest, so that our governors, even those of the most undoubted honour, have practised it. When they came to resolve on the report of the Grand Committee to give the money, they guarded their resolves very cautiously, to wit, quote, resolved that on the passage of such bills as now lie before the governor, the naturalization bill and other such bills as may be presented to him during the sitting, there be paid him the sum of £500. Do not, my courteous reader, take pet at our proprietary constitution, for these our bargain and sale proceedings in legislation. It is a happy country where justice and what was your own before can be had for ready money. It is another addition to the value of money, and, of course, another spur to industry. Every land is not so blessed. Unquote. Works, Vidlau edition, volume 3, pages 311 to 316. What was thought and said of this system depended entirely on one's point of view. Franklin ridiculed it when it worked against him. Afterwards, in the Revolution, when he saw the colonial self-government depended upon it, he became, like Dickinson and other patriot leaders, a staunch upholder of it. In England, it was regarded as corruption. There was plenty of corruption in England at the time, but outside corruption always seems the more heinous. and this particular corruption blocked and thwarted nearly all the plans of the mother country to regulate her colonies. It was believed to have seriously interfered with the raising of supplies and aids for the war against the French and Indians. If anything of the sort existed in our time, if a territory of the United States or an island like Puerto Rico were governed in that way, we would denounce it as most atrocious and absurd, and in all probability put a stop to it very quickly. It was very natural that England, acting from her point of view, should start to abolish it as soon as France was driven from the continent, and this attempt was one of the fundamental causes of the Revolution. The colonists who had become Americanized, tinged with the soil, differentiated from English influence, or, as Englishmen said, rebelliously inclined, were all enthusiastic supporters of the bargain and sale system. They loved it and were ready to die for it, and resisted any change or reform in it. They would not hear of fixing regular salaries upon the governors, because they knew that the moment the governors ceased to be dependent on the legislatures for their salaries, the legislatures would be powerless to accomplish the popular will, and the colonies, except Connecticut and Rhode Island, would fall completely under the control of Parliament and the King. Each legislature was called and adjourned by the governor, and he would hardly take the trouble to call it, except to pass crown measures, unless he was dependent on it for his salary. In every colony where this system prevailed, there was a body of popular laws on the statute book, which, in the course of 50 or 100 years, had been secured one by this bargaining with the governor. The people who were patriotically inclined loved these laws, and had enjoyed the contests for them. They had heard and read the details of these contests at the taverns and coffee houses, the self-confident, haughty, or scolding messages of the governor, and the astute or sarcastic replies of the legislature, and they fought the wordy battle over again with keen interest. So long as they controlled the governor's salary, they felt themselves free men. Once lose that control, and they were, as they expressed it, political slaves. The system extended to the judges, who, though appointed by the crown or governor, were dependent for their salaries on the annual vote or whim of the legislature. In New York, the judiciary was believed to be notoriously dependent. A chief justice, it was said, gave a decision against a member of the legislature who, promptly, in retaliation, had the judge's salary reduced £50. The local magistrates in New York were controlled by the assemblymen. Some of these magistrates could not write, and had to affix their marks to warrants. The colonists insisted that they must retain control of the judges' salaries, because if the crown both appointed the judges and paid them their salaries, the decisions would all be crown decisions. They were willing to compromise, however, and fix permanent salaries on the judges if the home government would agree that judges should be appointed for life and good behaviour instead of holding office at the pleasure of the crown. This apparently reasonable suggestion the English government would not adopt. They seemed to have feared that the judges appointed by that tenure would gradually drift to the side of the colonists and make regulation and administration more difficult than ever. It was already extremely difficult to get a jury to decide in favour of the crown. The control of the colonies seemed to be slipping away, and the ministry must retain as much of it as was possible. Those acts of Parliament by which the money raised from taxes on the colonies was not to be cast generally into the English exchequer, but to be used for, quote, defraying the expenses of government and the administration of justice in the colonies, unquote, and therefore would be all spent in the colonies. Read innocently enough. What could be more fair and honourable towards you, Englishmen would say, than an act which takes no money out of your country? It is the same money which you now raise by taxing yourselves. It will be spent in the same way as you apply it, to pay governors and judges, and on a fixed and regular system. But the quote, fixed and regular system, unquote, destroyed what the Americans considered their fundamental constitutional principle, by which executive salaries must be within popular control. That principle was vitally necessary to all the colonies, except Connecticut and Rhode Island. It would become vital to Connecticut and Rhode Island if they should lose the right to elect their own governors, as was not improbable when England began her remodeling after the expulsion of France from Canada. One effect of the system was to divide the upper classes of the colonists, and indeed all the people, into two parties: those who were interested in the governor and the executive officers, and those who were interested in the legislature. Around every governor appointed from England there grew up a little aristocracy of powerful families and individuals, with their patronage, influence, and branches extending down through all classes. The people of this party who had means and education considered themselves the social superiors, because they were most closely connected with England and the king, who was the source of all rank and nobility. They considered themselves the only American society that deserved recognition. Nearly all of them became loyalists in the Revolution. Among the legislative party, as it may be called, there were individuals and families of as much means and as good education as any in the governor's or executive party. But they formed a set by themselves, and were sometimes hardly on speaking terms with the executive party. In some of the colonies, the two parties were on friendly terms, but in Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts, the contests and hatred between them were, at times, extremely bitter and violent. Prominent men whose names have become household words among us: Hancock, Adams, and Warren of Massachusetts, Schloyer, Hamilton, and Livingston of New York, Reed, Morris, Dickinson, and Mifflin of Pennsylvania, Packer and Chase of Maryland, Lee, Washington, Bland, and Harrison of Virginia, were all of the Whig legislative set. They were more or less distinctly separated from the high society that basked in the regal sunlight, which, even when filtered through a colonial governor, was supposed to redeem America from vulgarity. Had the Revolution terminated differently, another class of names might be household words in America: Hunt, Galloway, Allen, and Hamilton of Pennsylvania, Delancey, Van Schack, and Jones of New York, Leonard, Sewell, Kerwin, and Oliver of Massachusetts, names which once filled a large place in the public vision, but which now are meaningless to nearly everyone. England's easy method of dealing with her colonies had certainly produced a confused and irregular state of affairs, which was worse than has yet been described. It is important for us to remember many of the details of this condition, because they show the beginning of English dissatisfaction with the colonies and of the desire to have a sweeping remodeling as soon as France was out of the way. The colonies, in exercise of extreme liberty that had been allowed them, had taken on themselves to create their own paper currency. In some of them, especially in New England, the paper currency was very seriously depreciated. In Pennsylvania, the currency never depreciated, but this did not help matters, because conservative people in England would regard it as merely a delusive encouragement of an evil system. This paper money the colonists considered absolutely necessary to supply the place of the gold and silver which were so rapidly drained from them into England to pay for the manufactured goods they bought. There seems to be no doubt but that they were right in this, and so long as the issues of paper money were kept within safe bounds, as in Pennsylvania, no harm resulted. But there were such disastrous results in other colonies that there was a great outcry in England. To many Englishmen, this paper money seemed to be a mere dishonourable device to avoid paying the heavy debts which the colonists owed to the British merchants, who sold to them the axes with which they felled the forest, the ploughs with which they tilled the land, and the utensils in which they cooked their dinners. This opinion was strengthened when it was remembered that some British colonies had attempted to pass stay laws to prevent English merchants from collecting debts, and that this risk had to be removed by an Act of Parliament in 1732, giving English merchants the same right to seize private property for debt in the colonies that they had in England. Finally, in 1751, Parliament tried to remedy the paper money evil and pass an act declaring the paper money of New England colonies an illegal tender in payment of a debt. Good people in England and many members of Parliament looked upon the whole revolutionary movement as merely an attempt of debt-ridden provincials to escape from their obligations. A nation on a firm gold basis always despises a nation struggling with a depreciated currency. We ourselves have had this feeling towards the West Indian and South American republics. The people in England also heard a great deal about the convicts who had been transported to America, and that some of these convicts had been employed as school teachers. Historical writers have given the number of these convicts that were sent here at from 10,000 to 25,000, most of them going to Maryland and the Middle Colonies. We may believe that this had no demoralizing effect upon us, and perhaps it had not. But English people would naturally think that it had tinged our population, and they would exaggerate the evil effects, as we would ourselves if we should hear of 20,000 convicts dumped into Japan or Cuba or England itself. In early colonial times, piracy had been almost openly practiced, and respectable people, even governors of colonies, were interested in its profits. The distinction between privateering, smuggling, piracy, and buccaneering was slight, the step from one to the other easy. The fascinating life of these brethren of the wave cannot be described here, except to say that piracy had been another item in the list of colonial offences. Protections to pirates were openly sold in New York, where the famous Captain Kidd lived, and handsome presents were given to the governor and his daughters. It was a profitable occupation, and pursued as eagerly as modern stock jobbing and speculation. Charleston was equally deep in the business. Lord Bellomont was sent out to New York in 1695 as the result of what we would now call a reform movement. He reported, quote, "a most licentious trade with pirates, Scotland, and Curaçao," unquote. The people of New York, he said, quote, "grew rich, but the customs they decrease," unquote. Piracy, however, had passed away, and it was only a recollection of disorder, part of the ancient training of the colonists in self-will and love of dependence. With regard to the other offences, bargain and sale legislation, dependent judiciary, or the reforms and remedies of them, both the colonists and England were in a constrained position so long as France kept strengthening her power on the north, and pushing round to the westward into the valleys of Ohio and the Mississippi. Kalm, the Swedish botanist who travelled in America in 1748, reported that the presence of the French in Canada was all that held the colonies in submission to England. He met both Americans and English who prophesied that the colonies would be absolutely independent within 30 or 50 years. The more we consider the conditions at that time, the more it becomes evident that the English-speaking communities in America were not colonies in the modern acceptance of the term. England had never fully reduced them to possession, had never really established her sovereignty among them. She had encouraged them in the beginning with liberal grants for the sake of persuading them to occupy the country, and after that she was unable to repress their steady and aggressive increase of privileges so long as France hung as a menace in the snowbound north. The lucky colonists were ridden with a loose rein and given their heads until a large section of them began to believe that their heads were their own. The colonists, however, needed the assistance of England's army and navy to withstand France. They detested the thought of becoming colonies of the great Celtic and Roman Catholic power, and they were willing to hold in check their desire for extreme privileges or anything like independence until France was removed from the continent. Thus, France occupied the peculiar position of encouraging our independent spirit and at the same time checking its extreme development. When the great event of her removal was accomplished, when the superb organizing genius of William Pitt had carried to a successful termination the long war lasting from 1654 to 1763, a totally new condition of affairs arose. Canada being conquered and England in possession of it, the colonies and England suddenly found themselves glaring at each other. Each began to pursue her real purpose more directly. England undertook to establish her sovereignty, abolish abuses, or, as she expressed it at that time, to remodel the colonies. The patriotic party among the colonists resisted the remodeling, sought to retain all their old privileges and even to acquire new ones.